Hi folks, thanks for tuning in. Depictions of violence have been an enduring feature of motion pictures since the inception of the medium. Violence has drawn filmmakers to explore its potential for cinematic stylization, and its presence on screen has fueled efforts to censor and regulate the medium. Movie violence has attracted audiences so deeply and incessantly that one could argue that depictions of violence constitute one of cinema's essential pleasures and appeals for viewers. Indeed, violent genres such as westerns, war and gangster movies emerged very early in cinema and have been with us ever since. Brian De Palma, the director of movies such as the Scarface remake and Mission Impossible, observed that cinema as a medium emphasizing movement is inescapably drawn towards violent action. He once said the following: "Motion pictures are a kinetic art form. You're dealing with motion, and sometimes that can be violent motion. There are very few art forms that let you deal with things in motion, and that's why westerns and chases and shootouts crop up in film." So for De Palma, the cinematic application of and emphasis on movement is what draws the medium to violence. Psychologists have run experiments to test the effects of viewing violent films. There have also been public anxieties about how viewing screen violence can lead people to behave violently in real life. This in turn has motivated the long history of movie censorship. So let's have a think about the ways in which movie violence has changed over the years, why it has changed, and what philosophical ideas have informed these changes. The philosophy of movie violence. The main resource for this clip comes from the book The Routledge Companion to Philosophy in Film, in a chapter titled Violence by Stephen Prince. As ever, I'll leave a link in the description below. A range of scientific studies point to a link between media violence and behaviour in susceptible individuals, generally those who already harbour violent fantasies or have experienced abusive upbringings, or have difficulty identifying the boundaries between real life and fictional worlds. Studies also show that individuals predisposed to act violently or harbour aggressive attitudes are more likely to immerse themselves in action films, most of which portray violence as an effective means of problem solving, whether it is for survival, revenge, retrieving a kidnapped child, or simply dealing with an evil threat. Violence tends to remove one's obstacles because narrative scenarios are set up which necessitate violent confrontations. One may note that in most of these types of movies, violence does not cause lasting negative consequences in the form of bleeding, bruising, broken bones, emotional suffering, and so on. Those who fall victim to violent acts typically get punched or shot, fall off the screen, and that's all we ever see. The bulk of violence shown in movies and television is sanitized in this way. Injury or death is quick and painless. Paradoxically, violence sanitized of its bleeding, bruising and emotional suffering, according to social scientists, actually poses the greatest potential harm to viewers. Fantasy violence risks teaching susceptible viewers that violence is fun, successful, and in a way, non-harmful. This is in spite of the fact that horror movies like the Friday the 13th series or Nightmare on Elm Street are more graphic and explicit, and they tend to provoke more public outrage. It seems strange to think that movies like The Avengers and Transformers, with their fantasy violence and focus on heroism, can be more damaging to society than horror movies, but there we go. This social scientific evidence undercuts the argument that watching violent media produces a cathartic experience, thus reducing the urge to harm others in real life. There is little empirical evidence in support of this idea. The concept of catharsis derives from Aristotle's Poetics, where in a discussion of tragedy, he observed that a tragic play induces pity and fear in the spectator, emotions which the drama then effectively purges in a cathartic way. So we supposedly work these negative emotions out of our system through art. While he wasn't talking about violence, this idea of catharsis was absorbed into popular thinking about cinema. For example, Sam Peckinpah, the director of The Wild Bunch from 1969, believed that the graphic bloodshed he put on screen would act as a kind of safety valve for society, enabling viewers to work off their aggressions in the comfort of the imaginary screen world. Peckinpah, in turn, was influenced by Aristotle's notion of catharsis and also by Antonin Artaud's theatre of cruelty. In his influential essays on the place of cruel spectacle in theatre, Artaud wrote that such dramatizations would be healthy, that they would drain social abscesses. He commented, "I defy any spectator to give himself up once outside the theatre to ideas of war, riot, and blatant murder." So there is no simple answer to the question of whether violent movies make the public more aggressive or violent. Like I say, there's little empirical support for the idea that movie violence is cathartic, making us less violent, but it doesn't usually make viewers more violent either. In other words, there's no simple correspondence between screen violence and the behaviour of viewers. It can depend on what the film is and who it is that's watching it. Connections between the screen world and real world violence are complex and are not easy to disentangle from other variables in the viewer's life, such as the conditions they live in, whether they grew up in an abusive home, whether they have mental health issues, and so on. But despite this complexity, there's plenty of concern in the public consciousness surrounding the formative influence of screen violence. So let's have a think about the ways in which movie conventions have changed over the years. Every generation seems to get more violent and previous generations look increasingly tame. The classic Universal monster movies, Dracula and Frankenstein, both of which came out in 1931, may seem tame today, yet in their time both were widely condemned for being unacceptably gruesome and horrific. Both films had numerous cuts made by censor boards. Gangster movies of the 1930s were also censored, particularly because of the excessive levels of killing with the use of Tommy guns, and also for showing the deaths of law enforcement officers. Conventions for depicting violence change over time, as do assessments by audiences about what counts as real and convincing. Dracula and Frankenstein were excessive films in their day, just as Hostel and The Hateful Eight have been more recently. Violence on the screen has two components: the depicted behaviour and the stylistic means through which it is presented. The behaviours themselves have not changed much over the course of film history. Characters have been beating on, shooting, stabbing and strangling one another practically since film began. But the stylistic designs that filmmakers have employed to present these behaviours have changed considerably in ways that make violent behaviour on the screen today more visceral and forceful. A brief survey of changing conventions in screen violence can indicate how boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable content have shifted. The Production Code Administration, known as the PCA, founded in the 1930s, worked with filmmakers to reduce this violent content in Hollywood films. The ideological assumption that guided the PCA was that depictions of violence to the human body were distasteful and were to be off limits to filmmakers. The title card at the start of the movie would say, "This picture approved by the Production Code Administration of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America." Since the PCA sought to reduce movie violence, filmmakers pushed in the opposite direction, coming up with creative solutions to symbolise violent imagery that could not be shown explicitly. In the original Scarface, made in 1932, when the gangster Gaffney, played by Boris Karloff, is machine-gunned down, viewers see instead a bowling pin that totters for a moment and then falls. Filmmakers during this period then could not simulate bullet strikes on the body. They had to find creative solutions like this instead. Filmmakers were, however, allowed to show damage done to property. They could show gunfire blasting into walls, shattering windows, blowing holes in furniture. As long as we didn't see bullet wounds on people, it was allowed. Violent death during this period sometimes signalled the onset of sleep rather than pain and anguish. In The Strange Love of Martha Ivers, a film noir made in 1946, Martha is shot in the belly at close range and she sinks peacefully out of the frame as if she were falling asleep. This type of tranquil death is common in films of the period, and it strikes modern viewers as being unrealistic because we're accustomed to seeing signs of bullet trauma and spasms in the bodies of gunshot victims. Martha's placid response to being shot is a highly stylized manner of representing a violent assault. But commercial movies today are not much better at capturing the essential truths about violence either, how it looks or what the repercussions are. Instead of making victims look like they are falling asleep, instead it exaggerates the way bodily trauma looks and hides the repercussions. Indeed, what has changed is that viewers today expect to see exaggerated evidence of physical trauma. The major turning point towards more intense and elaborated depictions of violence was in the 1960s, as the power of the PCA waned. Filmmakers who had long wanted to depict violence more explicitly, like the original Scarface movie for example, were finally able to do so. Acts of violence that would have been previously censored now flourished. Movies like Bonnie and Clyde, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, The Dirty Dozen and The Wild Bunch, all of which came out in the late 1960s, could never have been made any sooner. Bonnie and Clyde and The Wild Bunch applied slow motion and multiple camera montages during shootout scenes, which established a stylistic template for gun violence that predominated for more than a generation. The filmmakers used elaborate squibs to simulate bullet strikes on the characters, overturning a production code administration prohibition in flamboyantly bloody fashion. When Bonnie and Clyde are gunned down, their flesh and clothing erupt with visceral force. Peckinpah went so far as to rig squibs for entrance and for exit wounds in The Wild Bunch, and to put pieces of meat inside the explosive so that it would look like bits of the character were blown apart by the bullet. Ironically enough, violence in the 1930s and 40s seemingly took the violence out of violence, doing no serious visible harm to human beings even while killing them. The new approach emphasized the destructive power of violence, especially upon human flesh. Indeed, Peckinpah stated repeatedly that he wanted to put the sting, the pain, back into movie violence because he considered the previous Hollywood style to be excessively unrealistic. That said, Peckinpah always insisted that his style was artificial, but that through this artifice he could catch a truth about violence that Hollywood had avoided, namely that it dehumanizes people and destroys their humanity. He sought to portray this by emphasizing the grotesqueness of a character's extended death throes. Ironically, however, critics and viewers regarded his slow motion and montage editing to be inherently more realistic as a style than the existing norms that he sought to overturn. With its lengthy, detailed massacre scenes, The Wild Bunch was the most elaborately violent film that had yet been made. It had a major impact on the audiences because it made them conscious of a new way of looking at and filming screen violence. A new imagining of screen violence came with Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, which involved experimentation with the speed and angle of the camera's shutter, manipulation of the camera's lens, and methods of producing the film mixed with graphic depictions of bullet wounds and bodies being blown apart by explosives. Spielberg also replaced the reassuring narrative conventions of Hollywood's combat films, in which the death scenes of secondary and major characters occurred at predictable points in the story, with a more disturbing approach which acknowledges that amid the chaos of combat, death can come at any time for anyone. This idea has been taken further still by Game of Thrones, which is notorious for killing off major characters, sometimes in gruesome fashion at unexpected moments. The understanding that violent death can come at any moment separates the contemporary period from earlier eras of screen violence in which we usually know when it's going to happen. The widespread, ferocious and indiscriminate killing that Peckinpah showed in The Wild Bunch flourished subsequently not just in action movies but in horror movies too. By the 1970s and 80s, violence seemed to constitute a statement about the essentially pitiless nature of the universe. As these developments suggest then, films today are more unsparing of their audiences. They are crueler and are more visceral, in part because the screen technologies of violence with prosthetic limbs and digital effects make gruesome displays easier to achieve today, but perhaps also because viewers seem to regard such cruelty as offering a truer portrait of the world they inhabit. Indeed, this is why the brutality that shocked audiences in the 1930s seems tame today. In those earlier films, it occurs less frequently and is staged with greater tact and indirectness. In the 2000s, the cruelty on display continued to rise. In the horror genre, for example, a cycle of torture films found success at the box office, such as Saw, Hostel, Human Centipede, and their sequels. These movies constructed narratives around the abduction and slow torture of characters whose physical torment is visualized in lurid detail. Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ in 2004 retold the story of Jesus' torture by dwelling at length on the tearing and rending of his flesh during his scourging and crucifixion. Quentin Tarantino, notorious for his use of screen violence, has explored different kinds of stylization from the 1990s onwards. Mr. Orange, lying in a pool of his own blood in Reservoir Dogs, is a very different depiction of violence to the more cartoonish Kill Bill films. The fact that contemporary films are harsher and more detailed in their presentation of violence seems clear enough. But is it true that such an approach offers a truer account of the realities of human violence? Let's dwell on this for the rest of the clip. While viewers today are surrounded by media images of violence in the movies, on television and in video games, all of this is essentially unreal, fictitious violence. By contrast, imagery of actual real-world violence is far more regulated, censored and tightly controlled by the news media. The killing and maiming of overseas citizens, often targeted by Western forces, is rarely photographed despite extensive reporting in print media. The US government did not permit any filming of the returning caskets of American soldiers who died while fighting in Iraq. Imagery of the planes hitting the World Trade Center on September the 11th and the towers falling is readily accessible, but footage of people falling from the towers were more suppressed at the time, especially images of the remains where these victims hit the street. Following Hurricane Katrina, hundreds of bodies could be found in the streets of New Orleans, yet the news media refrained from showing the scale of these deaths. There's a paradox here. Fictitious violence is rampant, amplified and elaborated in contemporary culture, while the visual record of actual violence in the world is suppressed due to political agendas. As a result, we're left with a visual frame of reference for violence that is skewed, since we have a much clearer sense of fantasy violence than we do of the real thing. Cinema's privileging of action has meant that the representation of violence overwhelmingly occurs as a kind of stylistic extravaganza, where the emotional build-up and explosive release of violent energy takes precedence. The hero marches dramatically toward their climactic confrontation with an antagonist. The viewer keys up with anticipation, and an exciting, extensive action sequence shows a glorious battle in which the characters find numerous opportunities for dramatic and heroic deaths. Actual violence, of course, is different. And what the movies, fixated on spectacle, don't catch is the aftermath. In the movies, a killer's victims disappear quickly and we don't need to see their family, friends or colleagues. This is the main place where real-life violence has such a terrible impact. In life, those affected are far more numerous because the fallen have families, friends and acquaintances. The movies don't tend to capture this aftermath web of effects. The lingering pain that the loss of a loved one creates has never been as interesting for mainstream filmmakers as it is to stage and stylize scenes of violent confrontation. The aftermath is more inward, less visually dynamic. Violence, then, is a fundamental category for expression in cinema, one that has always exerted great attraction for filmmakers and audiences, and yet the medium's grasp of this subject is partial, biased, and misleading. So to summarise then, we've looked at the complexities of how viewers are affected by media violence, and have found it can depend on who is coming into contact with the material. Most people don't tend to become more violent as a result of engaging with action and horror movies, but those who are more emotionally disturbed may be more affected and are also more likely to engage with violent media. We've also looked at the ways in which screen violence has changed over the years and why it became more gratuitous. In turn, we finally looked at the ways in which screen violence has become more visceral in cinema, yet as a human phenomenon, violence retains a power and complexity that popular cinema in particular usually fails to grasp. So, as ever, thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a like, comment and subscribe. Bye for now.